click subscribe and hit that bell notification.
Okay, open up your Bibles to 2 Samuel 11. This is David and Bathsheba. What happened with David and Bathsheba? Bad things, adultery. So David steals another man's wife. Then what did he do to that man? He had him murdered in battle. Chapter 12, Nathan rebukes David, and he says that there's going to be consequences. Chapter 12, verse 11, thus says the Lord, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and I will give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. And I missed, verse 10. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house. So those are the three main punishments for David's act with Bathsheba. The sword will never depart from Israel. His neighbor will take his wives, and he will lose his child, right? So we find at the end of the chapter that David loses his infant child. In chapter 13, we find Amnon and Tamar. Amnon is the son of David. Tamar is the daughter of David, of different women. And Amnon rapes Tamar, his half-sister. Kind of the story moves along. Absalom takes offense at Amnon. Absalom is the brother of Tamar, full brother, same mom, same dad, half-brother of Amnon. For 2 full years, Absalom plots to kill Amnon. Absalom kills Amnon, flees for his life because he's committed murder. And chapter 14, Absalom is brought home. Chapter 15, Absalom, after 4 long years, commits a conspiracy to overthrow the throne of his father David. So Absalom tries to take rulership over Israel. He divides Israel very cunningly, very well, because David has to pack up his house and flee. So David flees out of Israel. Absalom takes charge. He takes David's 10 concubines up on the roof, and he sleeps with them in front of all of Israel. And this has a lot of political meaning as well as what God had told him would be a punishment for David. David, chapter 16, flees for his life from Absalom. Chapter 17, David finds out that he's not alone. He has lots of friends, lots of support, resources. And what we're going to find in chapter 18 is that all of this has come to a head. This has taken 6 years since Absalom committed his crime against Amnon. But before that, this was all determined to be a discipline and a correction and a punishment for David for what he did with Bathsheba. So God told him, you will suffer for committing this sin. You have scorned my name, and you will suffer the consequences. So he lost 1 son. Now he lost another son. And now his 3rd son is rebelling against him and trying to usurp him and take the throne. David is in Mahanaim, which is a kind of citadel city. It is a capital city of Ephraim. And so he's outside of Jerusalem, and now they're about to have a battle. They're going to go to war, father against son, Israel against David's men. Chapter 18, verse 1. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will go out with you. So what we find is that David is officially going to respond. Up until this point, he has done a lot of spy work, a lot of cunning, underhanded things to usurp Ahithophel's counsel with Hushai's counsel. And so it's really played out in David's benefit to now he can actually respond with strength and attack back to what's been happening to him. And he puts in charge Joab. Is that a surprise? Joab has been the commander of David's army for decades. Abishai is Joab's brother and has also been a leading figure in David's army. So those are not shocking. But then we get to Ittai the Gittite. Is that surprising? We don't know Ittai. He doesn't have a lot of affiliation with David. What's interesting is a couple of chapters ago when David was fleeing for his life, Ittai came with him. And he said, hey, I'm going to follow you and I'll go where you go. And he's like, why? You showed up yesterday. Like, you just got here. This isn't your problem. Go back to the city. You'll be fine. Like, my son will leave you alone. You have no party in this. And he's like, no, where you go, I go. And he's like, okay. And so now we find that he's actually kind of the third regent in David's army. He is a man of power and authority. So he's actually very wise. He's very well respected, and he's a Gittite, so he's a foreigner. So David has a very eclectic army. What we find is that he's got Philistines, he's got Ammonites, he's got all of the vagabonds from all of these other cities that have come to him in his years of wandering, and they are very dedicated. They are very loyal to David. And now we get another one, and that is Ittai. Now the king says, I will go out with you. Is that a good idea? So logically, David, they're usurping the throne. You are the king. If they kill you, they get everything. So no, that's what they're going to say in verse 3. But the men said, you shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. So this is showing us the true value of the men in that room. The king is the most important person. The king dies, everything is lost. If 10,000 people die, but the king lives, they still have strength. They still have options. They still have possibilities of regaining the kingdom. Now, it's interesting. In verse 4, the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. David has really stepped back out of his leadership. He has stepped down. He has submitted himself to his men. And instead of stepping up and leading in the forefront, which is kind of his historical, personage, this is what he's always done. He lets his men decide what he should do. Now, I'm not sure this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a change of pace. It's a weird scenario for David. And I think it's smart because it empowers his men to make decisions. As a good leader, you need to step back and let your people learn how to make decisions. But at the same time, it can also become too submissive, where people are going to think that you're losing authority. People are not going to respect you as much. So David is doing something interesting here because it's different for him, and he's listening to his men in a very passive manner. Verse 5, he says, whatever seems right to you. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. So this is a pretty large group of people. We found that there's been no numbers given to us so far about David's army, about how many people are with David. It just told us that he needs supplies. So people were coming to him and bringing beds and food and wine and camels and donkeys for people to ride on and, things to nourish the people. That's what we found the last chapter, verse 27 through 29. And so David has thousands of people with him. He's not just he and his small merry men. This is a encampment of people. This is husbands and wives and sons and daughters and soldiers. This is commanders and people of hundreds and of thousands. And so they go marching out. Verse 5, and the king ordered Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So this is interesting that David would tell his commander something, and it says that the entire army heard it. That means that communication is very fluid in David's army. If somebody gives a command, everybody hears it. It's a rapid flow of information. So they're very fast and they're very effective in knowing what they should be doing and the directions that are being given by the king. But what are the directions that he gives here? Deal with Absalom gently. The enemy hey guys, I know that there is a rebellion going on. I know that there's a civil war, but I need you to go out there and be some gentle warriors. That's the mentality that he's instilling into his men. I need you to show some compassion and some mercy to that young man. For whose sake? For my sake, right? Please be gentle to me. That's my baby boy. So he tells that to his generals, the three of them, and the whole army hears it. Verse 6, so the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. We don't know much about that forest. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. So the men of Israel versus the servants of David, who won? The servants of David won against the forces of Israel. Now, how many died? 20,000 people. That's a big battle. Now, up until this point, we feel like Absalom is kind of just ruling the city. He does have people on his side. They've gone out and pronounced it. He had spies go out throughout the land and proclaim Absalom's the king. So there's been this aura of Absalom kind of taking power and taking authority in the kingdom, but I don't think we realize how secure he became and how quickly he became secure, because he gathered 50 or 60,000 people together to go fight against David. And David gathered thousands of people as well. So if 20,000 people die, people don't die that quickly in battle. Like, you get your arm chopped off and you don't just like die. It's not like getting shot in the head. Like, people get stabbed in the gut and they're like, all right, I'm going to wander home now. There's a lot of survival rates in these armies. And so for 10,000 people to die means that there's probably upwards of 60 to 70,000 people fighting at this point. And so it says that David's men won. This is a good news. This is great. Now what's interesting is in verse 8, it says the battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. Okay, so, 80,000 people, and what do they have in their hand? Swords. And a couple of those people, more people who died by sword, died in the forest. So they went wandering into the forest. How did they die? Like, it doesn't tell us. It's just a weird scenario. More people died from the forest? That, if anything, says that it is the divine protection of David. That though God is punishing him, though he is going through these circumstances, God's purpose is to reestablish David. Though he's been cast out for a season, he is going to make him king again. And how do we know that? I mean, the trees fought against Absalom. The land repulsed Absalom. It is a divine power of God. So we get this weird interaction in verse 8. Verse 9, and Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under a thick branch of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule was under him, and it went on. What happens here? What is that talking about? Didn't chop off his head. His long, luscious hair. This is a throwback to a couple of chapters ago when it talks about, what was the description of Absalom? He was like the most handsome man in Israel, taller than everybody, and his hair weighed 5 pounds. When he would cut his hair off at the end of the year, he had this big bunch of hair. What a manly man. Now he's going riding around on his mule, and what happens? That hair came back to haunt him. That pride, that stature of what made him the most desirable man cursed him. And he was caught by his hair, hanging in a tree. Biblically, it says, not on the earth, and caught between heaven. Right? So when we're using the word heaven here, what is it talking about? The sky, where birds fly around. That's the first heaven. It's the atmosphere that we live in. So he's literally dangling with his feet off the ground, caught by his hair, and he can't get down. There's nothing he can do. He's just swinging back and forth. So here is a man who curses his father, the Lord's anointed, and now he is finding himself accursed by his own beauty. Verse 10, and a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. What is Joab saying? Right, I would have promoted you, dude. I would have given you a belt of authority. I would have paid you 6 months' wages. I would have taken care of you. Why didn't you do that? Verse 12, but the man said to Joab, even if I felt my hand in the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would have not reached out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood afar off or aloof. What is his excuse? The king sees and hears everything. It's like Jesus, omniscient. There's no escaping his knowledge of what is going on in the planet, what is going on in the universe, in the galaxy. Jesus knows all things. David is so interconnected with his men, nothing escapes him. So he says, 1, the king would have found out. 2, if you would have given me 1,000 pieces of silver, it would not have been enough. And if I would have done it and the king found out, you would have turned your back on me. You wouldn't have given me anything. You would have stood way far away to absolve yourself of the guilt. So what do you think Joab's going to say to that? He's like, you're wasting my time. This is what he says. Verse 14, Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak tree. So he literally put up his hand and was just like, just shut up. Just be quiet. I'm not wasting my time with you anymore. If you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. That's the one. Joab's like, I'm surrounded by soldiers. I could command somebody to do this, but you know what? You're wasting my time. And he picks up 3 spears and he walks over there and he gets them. Where does he get them? Right in the heart. That could be an act of mercy because it would be a quick death. But 3? That doesn't sound like mercy. He has a very important point that he wants to make. This is what happens to rebels. This is what happens to those who are committed to treason. This is the consequence of going against the throne. He is sending a very clear message. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be the king's son. This is what will happen to you. Now, is he wrong? He shouldn't be wrong. That's capital punishment. That's how it's supposed to go. If you're charged and committed with treason in the United States, you know what the punishment is? It's death. If you are tried and found guilty for treason, you get killed by the firing squad. Do we actually do that? It's like you get the death penalty and you're supposed to get the needle. We'll give it 10 years. We'll come back and discuss it. So he says, don't waste my time. And they took Absalom, threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. Do you know what the punishment was for rebellion? A child against his parents? If parents came to the elders in the community and said, my kid is stubborn, won't listen to me, they're a vagabond, they're drunkards, they're fools, they're committing crimes, and we can't stop them, then the whole community gets together and stones them. That is Levitical law for a rebellious child. God says, if you rebel against your parents, you get stoned to death. The other side of that is also true. If you bless your parents and you honor your parents, it will go well with you. If you want to be blessed, honor your parents. If you want to be stoned to death, rebel against your parents. Those are your 2 choices. And so Joab not only spears him, but throws him in a pit and raises stones over him, because that's what stoning is. It's not like we just hit you in the head a couple times with a rock and once you're dead, we leave you alone. No, they bury the body in stones, and it becomes a memorial of stoning. Those rocks are now unclean because they've touched dead flesh, so no Jew would get close to it. it would become a tomb and a memorial of the consequences of sin. If you'd walk around and find piles of stone everywhere, you would say, wow, there's no tolerance for sin in this place. And that is the stance that Joab is taking. No mercy, no understanding, no compassion, complete justice. And so he throws him in a pit and covers it with stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own house. That's their enemies. That's the people who came to rebel against David. Once they lost the battle, they ran home. The army scattered. Verse 16, then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. That's interesting. There were some angry people. Threw him in the forest, raised over him a very great heap of stones, and all Israel fled to his own town. Verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar of his own name, and he called Absalom's monument to this day. In chapter 14, verse 27, it says that Absalom had 3 sons. And here it says that Absalom had no sons. So what happened? They died. Or something that could happen, I just was reading about this, I didn't even know this was a thing. It was common in the ancient world that if a father had passed away and they were very honorable, the sons would erect a monument to them. Or a son would be expected to act like them and kind of become the personage of their father to keep on the memory of that person. If the father was dishonorable and disreputable, the sons would actually reject the heritage, reject his name, and act as if they had no father. So there's 2 sides to this. It could be that they rejected their father Absalom, or they died a premature death, that his family just suffered. It's very similar to Judah's kids. God did not like Judah's kids. Judah's son married a girl. God didn't like him, killed him. So then she went to one of the brothers. God didn't like him either, so he killed him. And then went to another brother, and he killed him. When God doesn't like people, he gets rid of them. And so it could be possible that because of Absalom, because the sins of the father was visited upon the children, that as he rebelled against God, God's selection of the king, God punished him by taking his children. It's a lot of bit between the lines. We're inferring based on what the text says, but it could be those options. Okay, verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Who is Ahimaaz? Is the son of Zadok. Zadok is the high priest. There's 2 high priests at this point. One kind of ministers to David directly. Zadok ministers to the whole, over the tent of the tabernacle that David had built for the ark. So Ahimaaz was part of the spies that helped David when he needed information out of the city. Hushai would give information to Zadok. Zadok would give it to Ahimaaz. Ahimaaz would take it to David. So he is very close to the inner network of David. He is excited about this event. He's excited that the war has been won and now he can go home. This is a great day. Let me go tell the king. But Joab says no. Why would Joab say no? Absalom was not supposed to be killed. Absalom has been killed. And he says the king has lost his son. This is not the news you want to send. So if Sean came up to me and was like, hey, I want to take the news, I'm like, no. And then I look at Ruth and I say, Ruth, you take the news. How do you think I feel about Ruth? I probably would be less concerned with her safety. If I look at Sean and I say no, but I tell somebody else yes, then obviously I favor Sean over Ruth. So Joab turns around and he says, verse 21, said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. What's a Cushite? From the country of Cush, not an Israelite. He's a foreigner, potentially a slave, potentially a mercenary, potentially just a foreigner who's participating in the events of Israel. A very unimportant person. So Joab looks at Ahimaaz and he's like, sorry, buddy, not today. And then he looks at this Cushite and he's like, you go do it. Verse 22, and Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son? That's very endearing. Seeing that you will have no reward for the news. He's saying you're not going to receive anything good from this. There's nothing to be had here. Don't do it. Verse 23, come what may. What does that mean? Let it be. It is what it is. Look, if there's negative consequences, I'll deal with it. I want to talk to the king. And if this is going to be negative, let me manage it. And he said, I will run. So he said to him, run, go ahead. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So the plain was longer, but easier, flatter, more level, easier to run. And the mountainous region that the Cushite took would be faster, more direct, but slower with the hills. Verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. So this is a messenger. And he drew near and near, and the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. He's very hopeful. Only Ahimaaz would come with good news, not bad news. Now, it's interesting that he could tell who's running by the gait, by the stature, right? This is, I think, something that we miss in our culture. I have keys that I walk around with and they jangle. When I go walking down the hallway, my employees know when I'm coming. This is a natural thing. When your boss comes walking around the corner, there's a certain level of alertness. Like you perk up and you want to work harder. You want to be more attentive to your task at hand. You don't want to be found not doing your job. I've come around the corner and almost always all my employees are working. It's weird. But I was walking around the corner and one of my employees was like, I knew it was you. I could tell because it's your stride. I have a tempo to my stride that is identifiable to me alone. So Ahimaaz has run so much amidst the crowd with the army. This guy is not only the son of a priest, so therefore is a priest, he is a warrior. He is out there fighting with the guys. He is participating in battle. He is part of David's clan, David's crew. And so they spot him from afar off and they're like, that's the good man bringing good news. There's a lot of history that David drags up right there. The problem is, it's not good news. It's set up for failure. Verse 28, then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. And the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? What else could he have asked about? What could David have asked of this messenger? How are the men? How many injured? How did we win? Was it a good battle? A bad battle? What was the victory like? Did they flee? Did we lose a little bit? How many people died? Instead, there is no response. There's no joy. There's no thank you, Jesus. There's no praise and glory given to God, even though the first thing the messenger says, thank the Lord, for he has delivered us from all of your enemies. He simply says, what happened to Absalom? The leveling of anxiety that the king is feeling is immediately impressed upon Ahimaaz. And so what would Ahimaaz say to that? What would you say to that? I'm not sure, O king. You know, I came here, I was pretty excited. I actually really ran all of this way just to see you. I wanted to be the guy to give you the message, but right now, I don't want to be the guy. So you know what? He says, verse 29, and the king said, is it well with the young man? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I don't know what it was. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. Right, he still had an opportunity to dialogue with his messenger. He says, okay, fine, stand right here, be quiet. Who knows how far away that other guy was? This is not a happy king. He is not joyful about the scenario that he has finally won and can go home and reclaim his throne. Verse 31, and behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who raised up against you. And the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. I think that's just about as nice as you can put it. And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. David is concerned with one thing. It's the broken heart of a father. He has lost all compass to his role as a leader, as a king, and he has given himself to one thing, heartbreak. There is no other dialogue. He hears that his son died. He immediately starts to burst out in tears and leaves. There's a lot that goes on when it comes to having a battle. As a leader, you need to be there with your men. And he leaves. And he goes upstairs into a room to weep and cry over his son. Chapter 19. It was told Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. So what was the feeling of the army when they returned home? Sorrow, sullen, shame, defeat. For a strong army, retreat is not an option. They don't have that in their bones. They will stand and fight until the last man. There is no retreat. There is no fleeing for your life. You will stand, you will fight, and we will win or we will lose. And when they came home, they lost. When they came home, they had retreated. They had fled before their enemy. That is how they felt. They had an overwhelming victory. God was on their side. The entire force fought for them. And yet, their joy quickly turned to gloom. Why? Because the king was mourning for his son. He was not rejoicing for his men. He was mourning for his son. And his men felt it. They felt the disrespect. They felt the shame that their leader hated them and wished that they would have died instead of his son. And that is a betrayal of leadership. Verse 4, the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. And Joab came into the house to the king and said, you have today covered with shame the faces of your servants, who have this day saved your life, the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you, and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, behold, the king is sitting in the gate, and all the people came before the king. So what is the rebuke that Joab brings against the king? He said this, you love your enemy. Is that a problem? What would Jesus say? He says love your enemy. That's not a problem. You can love your enemy. See, Joab doesn't say you love your enemy alone. He says, you love your enemy and you hate those who love you. You have turned your back on that which is good. You have stopped being loyal to those who are loyal to you. Yes, you can love your enemy, but you have to love those who love you. those who have sacrificed their lives for you, those who rescued your life. It is not right for you to turn your back on those who fought for you, defended you, for those who sought your life. So the problem wasn't loving his son. The problem was loving his son more than he loved his men. His priorities were wrong. He put on his father's hat. He wore the heart of a father and not a king. He was first and foremost the king of Israel, second father of Absalom. And he had forgotten that. And so he had to get pushed by his men. He had to be directed by his men. He had to be led by his men because he was not leading them. He was being led. And so he goes back down to the gate. What was the warning that he gave him? He says there's consequences if you do not correct your actions. You'd be left alone. In one night, you will lose the loyalty of everybody. And everything you've suffered in your entire life is nothing compared to what would happen. All of the evil that you dealt with in your youth, you remember being betrayed by Saul? You remember Saul running and chasing after you and these men stood with you? You will have no one beside you and everybody will hunt you. It will be worse in your future if you do not correct this. So what does David do? He obeys. He goes back down and he sits back into the gate. It doesn't say that he gave a speech. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't talking. He went and he sat down and his men came to him. It was a time of difficulty, but they returned back to him. And it's amazing to think because these men have been with David for over 20 years. They fought with him tooth and nail. They suffered with him, wandering around. They were there in Ziklag when the marauders came and stole all of their children and their wives and their livestock and everything, and they burned the city to the ground. They were there with David when they went and rescued them. These men are men of valor, but they are brothers in arms. And for them to feel so tempted to lose their loyalty is shocking. This one act of weeping over the wrong thing, valuing the wrong thing, jeopardized all of the loyal relationships that David has received over decades because he valued the wrong thing at the wrong time. I really like this term, come what may, because that's what David said in chapter 16. There was a man on a hill cursing David, saying that you're going to suffer for the bloodshed of Saul. This is a good thing that your son is attacking you. You deserve it. You're a bad guy. You're a man of blood. You're a dirtbag. And this man was shouting at David. And one of David's guys, Abishai, the second commander in the army, he came up to David and he's like, hey, I'm going to go cut that dude's head off. Do you remember what David said? No. What if the Lord told him to do that? What if the Lord told him to curse me? Then let the Lord decide, come what may. If the Lord has determined this, then let's ride the wave. Is that what David did in this last scenario? Nope. He fought against the will of God. He was upset that Absalom was killed. It was God's will that Absalom would go through that. It was his plan to do this, to punish David and to punish Absalom. It's very specific in the last chapter. God had usurped Ahithophel's counsel with Hushai's counsel so that he could bring punishment against Absalom. But in this moment, David lacked concern for his men and concern for God's will. He didn't say, come what may. Maybe this is of the Lord. He said, I don't like it. I don't want it. I want nothing to do with this. That's my son Absalom. And he got stuck on repeat. He got stuck in sorrow instead of recognizing the value of God's discipline, the value of God's predetermined plan of these events. And instead of trusting in his goodness and his righteousness, he got bitter and sorrowful over the loss of his son. This is the opposite of Abraham. When God said, give me your son, what did Abraham do? Here he comes. He picked up a knife David, that's normally his MO. He's very faithful, very, very dedicated. No matter what, he would sacrifice anything. He's a man after God's own heart. But here, it's not possible. He held on to himself. He held on to his son. He held on to his selfishness and couldn't let go. And we discussed this earlier, that he needed to be a king first, then a father. He was dealing not with a son. He was dealing with a turncoat, a traitor, a usurper, a treasonous, rebellious, wicked person. This man had stolen his wives. This man had sought to kill people so that he could take the throne. This man had killed his son. He was a rebellious man who deserved capital punishment. He deserved death. And David needed to recognize that first. Then he could play the father after that. He needed to fulfill justice. Then he could give grace and mercy. Do you know what God did for us? Before he came to us and said, hey, I love you. I want to rescue you. I'm going to take care of you. I will deliver you from your sin. I will free you from sin and the punishment of sin. Do you know what he said? I will pay the price of your sin. I will enact justice. I will be a good judge, and I will judge the guilty and punish sin. After sin was punished on the cross, then he came to us with grace and mercy. Then he came to us and he says, I will bring you forgiveness, and I will give you grace, and I will give you new life, and I will bless you in the knowledge of me, and we will become one, and I will unite with you for eternity, and we will live forever, a family in Christ. First justice, then grace and mercy. And David flipped it around. Before they even went out to battle, instead of encouraging his men, fight strong, fight for your women, your children, fight for your country, for this usurper, go out and defeat him. Instead, he says, be kind, be gentle. It's wrong. Even God's character tells us so. And then discipline. This is the third son that David has lost. This is the third life for the sin that he committed with Bathsheba. This is the gift that never stops paying. David suffers so much for that sin with Bathsheba. And what's interesting is as a church, as a body of people who study the Bible, I feel like we take David and Bathsheba's story and we talk about their story, but we never really follow through with the consequences. This is years and years and years and decades of David's life affected by sin. It was one moment, one choice, one catastrophic failure in moral ethics, and David suffers for the rest of his life. That's the consequence of sin. When we sin, we don't know the toll that will come our way, but we will pay that toll for a very, very long time. Sin is deadly, and David forgot about that for one moment, and he's lost 3 children. Potentially, Absalom lost 3 children. Okay, next week we will continue on 2 Samuel chapter 19, and this will be restoration and renewal. David is going to be coming back into Jerusalem, but there is still some work that needs to be done politically, and there's still a divide in the country, and David's going to have to get restored and renewed to the throne.